In the summer of 1943, most B-17 crews didn't survive long enough to finish 11 missions. Tail gunners died even faster. Michael Aru decided to ignore the rulebook, because following it was getting men killed. At 6:15 on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Aru crawled into the tail position of his B-17 at RAF Kimbolton. A gray English dawn stretched ahead, 500 miles into Germany. He was 24 years old on his 12th combat mission, with 3 confirmed kills. Along the route to Kassel, the Luftwaffe had positioned more than 300 fighters. Aru settled onto the bicycle seat that served as his workstation. The tail position was 4 feet wide, 5 feet long. 2.50 caliber Browning machine guns pointed through a plexiglass window. At 25,000 feet, the outside temperature dropped to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. His electrically heated suit was the only barrier between survival and hypothermia. The 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war. The tail gunner worked alone, separated from the crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. No one to help, no warning. Just a man, 2 guns, and whatever came from behind. The statistics were brutal. In the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died faster than anyone except ball turret gunners. German fighters preferred rear attacks. The tail absorbed the first fire. By July, the 379th Bomb Group had already lost 9 aircraft in 2 months, 90 men gone. The reason was geometry. Attacking from the rear gave German pilots the longest firing window. A Bf-109 closing from 6 o'clock at 350 miles per hour had nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. The tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to respond, at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Most never got the chance. The FW-190 carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. One burst could shatter the plexiglass, kill the gunner, and damage the tail controls. Bombers without tail protection became easy targets. Standard Army Air Forces training told gunners to wait. Conserve ammunition, fire only under 300 yards. On paper, it made sense. In combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already firing. By the time a tail gunner opened up, he might already be dead. Aru had seen it on his 6th mission. A B-17 off the right wing took a direct hit to the tail. The gunner never fired. The fighter came in fast, guns blazing. The first rounds punched through the plexiglass. The bomber dropped out of formation, trailing smoke. 8 parachutes appeared. The tail gunner was not among them. Doctrine demanded patience. Aru questioned all of it. German pilots attacked from maximum range because they knew American gunners would hold fire. The Luftwaffe had learned the patterns and exploited the manual like a roadmap. That morning, 186 B-17 lifts off from eastern England. 123 P-47 Thunderbolts would escort them part way. But fuel limits meant the fighters would turn back over Belgium. The final 200 miles to Kassel would be flown alone. Aru checked his ammunition belts, 400 rounds per gun, 800 total. The manual said it was enough. Aru already believed the manual was wrong. By noon, he would find out. Being wrong meant a closed casket and a telegram home. The formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet, still climbing. The white cliffs of Dover faded behind them. France, then Belgium, then Germany. The P-47s held position, their presence meaning safety for now. Aru knew the math. Thunderbolts had fuel for about 90 minutes. The mission would take 6 hours. For most of it, the bombers would be alone. On earlier missions, Aru had followed Doctrine: wait, aim carefully, fire short bursts, conserve ammunition. Instructors drilled it into every student. Accuracy over volume. That doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate. The Luftwaffe did not. They knew the tail gunner waited until 300 yards, so they opened fire at 600. Cannon shells tore into bomber formations while American gunners held their triggers. By the time the tail gunner fired, the damage was already done. Aru calculated the problem differently. An FW-190 at 600 yards wasn't a hard target. It was flying straight at him, nose pointed directly at his position, presenting the largest possible profile. With the closing speed, the apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who fired early could walk his tracers onto the target, correcting aim as the range collapsed. The risk was ammunition. 800 rounds sounded like a lot until you divided it by the number of attacks. A mission could mean 15, 20, even 30 passes. At 50 rounds per burst, the math turned brutal. A gunner who fired early might run dry before the mission ended. Aru accepted the trade. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made a worse bargain. Survival meant disrupting the attack before it succeeded. If that meant running low later, he would deal with that problem then. Dead men had no use for reserve ammunition. His first real test came on a raid against submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire in June. Two Bf-109s approached from 6 o'clock low, the classic tail attack. Doctrine said wait. Aru opened fire at 700 yards. The tracers arced out, falling short at first, then climbing toward the lead fighter. The German pilot saw the fire coming and broke off, diving away before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed. Neither scored a hit. After landing, the crew chief confronted Aru. The ammo count showed nearly 200 rounds expended in a single engagement. At that rate, he would be empty long before reaching targets deep in Germany. Aru explained his reasoning. The crew chief wasn't convinced. Word spread. Some tail gunners called it reckless. Long-range fire violated everything the manuals taught. The rules existed for a reason, they said. Aru was gambling with his crew's lives. But Aru kept coming home. Mission after mission, his bomber returned to Kimballton intact. Other aircraft in the squadron did not. By mid-July, 3 bombers were gone, 30 men lost. Now, on July 30th, crossing into Belgium, Aru watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings and turn back toward England. Fuel gauges decided the matter. The bombers pressed on alone. Somewhere ahead, more than 300 German fighters were waiting. Aru would need every round he had. He would also need to live long enough to use them. The first Messerschmitts appeared at 11:42, climbing from the southeast in groups of 4. Aru counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting. The sky behind the formation filled with black crosses and yellow noses. One fighter rolled into its attack from 6 o'clock high, diving toward the bombers at nearly 400 miles per hour. Aru tracked it through the gun sight. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers. The Brownings roared. Tracers streaked out, falling short, vanishing below the diving aircraft. Aru adjusted, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, the tracers connected. Bright flashes sparked along the fighter's engine cowling. Smoke streamed back as the pilot broke hard right, abandoning the attack. He never fired a shot. The fighter spiraled downward and vanished into the clouds. Aru didn't watch it fall. The second attacker was already closing, coming in lower, trying to slip beneath his field of fire. The angle forced him to depress the guns nearly to their mechanical limit. He fired anyway. A long burst reached out. The FW-190 pilot flinched, pulling up early and dumping his cannon shells into empty sky above the bomber. The attack failed. For the next 47 minutes, the assaults never stopped. Wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the formation, hunting stragglers and damaged aircraft. Aru fired at everything that entered range, burning ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels glowed red. At 12:29, a Bf-109 approached directly from astern, flying straight and level. It was either extraordinary courage or poor judgment. Aru centered the fighter and held the triggers down. For 6 seconds, the Brownings hammered, sending more than 100 rounds into the aircraft. The Messerschmitt came apart. The engine tore free, the wings folded back, and the wreckage tumbled past the bomber. Close enough for Aru to see the empty cockpit. 2 confirmed kills, ammunition down to 180 rounds. At 12:51, the formation reached Kassel and began its bombing run. For 11 minutes, the bombers flew straight and level, unable to maneuver while bomb aimers lined up their targets. The Luftwaffe knew this was the moment of maximum vulnerability. The attacks intensified. An FW-190 dove in from 5 o'clock. Aru fired a short burst. The rounds struck the wing root, but the fighter kept coming. Cannon shells tore through the tail section. Aru felt the impacts before the pain. 20mm fragments shredded the plexiglass, ripped through his flight suit, and buried themselves in his left arm and shoulder. His left gun jammed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed the compartment. He kept firing with the right gun, one-handed, bleeding. As the damaged FW-190 pulled away, Aru tracked it and fired again. The final burst hit the tail. The fighter snap-rolled and plunged toward the ground. His third kill of the mission. The intercom crackled. Damage reports, flak warnings. But Aru couldn't answer. His mouth had gone dry. Blood pooled on the floor of the tail compartment, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero air. 400 rounds expended, 63 remaining. 3 German fighters destroyed, and the mission was only half over. The bombers still had 250 miles to fly back to England through the same gauntlet that had nearly killed him on the way in. Aru wrapped a scarf around his wounded arm and waited. The return flight began at 13:04. The formation turned west, leaving Kassel burning beneath a column of black smoke. Aru stayed at his post, scanning the sky through blood-smeared plexiglass. The Luftwaffe wasn't finished. Over Belgium, German fighters regrouped along the bomber stream's route to the Channel. Fresh aircraft replaced those lost earlier. The second gauntlet would be just as deadly. Aru's left arm had gone numb from cold and blood loss. His jammed gun was dead, the feed mechanism shattered by the same shell that wounded him. He had 1 working weapon and 63 rounds of ammunition. The math had changed. With 63 rounds, he could afford maybe 3 engagements, 20 rounds each, no mistakes. Every trigger pull now had to count. By 13:31, the luxury of suppressive fire was gone. A pair of Bf-109s closed from the 7 o'clock position. Aru waited until 500 yards, then fired a precise 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck the engine cowling. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing glycol coolant. The wingman broke off without attacking. 51 rounds remaining. At 14:15, the formation crossed into France. Fighter attacks thinned as the Luftwaffe reached the limits of its operational range. By 14:47, the bombers had outrun the last interceptors. 20 minutes later, the English Channel appeared on the horizon. They landed at Kimbolton at 15:52. Aru couldn't climb out of the tail compartment on his own. Ground crew pulled him through the narrow hatch and carried him to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon counted 11 fragment wounds across his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Within hours, word spread through the 379th Bomb Group. The tail gunner of De Leo had scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables while wounded, fighting with 1 gun and 63 rounds of ammunition. The mission intelligence report noted his early engagement technique as a contributing factor to bomber survival. Other tail gunners started asking questions. Doctrine said wait until 300 yards. Aru opened fire at 800. Doctrine said conserve ammunition. Aru burned through more than 700 rounds before being hit. Doctrine produced dead gunners. Aru was still alive. The squadron gunnery officer reviewed the gun camera footage. It showed Aru's tracers reaching far beyond standard engagement range, disrupting attacks before German pilots could establish stable firing solutions. Early fire forced evasive maneuvers, degraded accuracy, and reduced hits on the bombers. By mid-August, 3 other tail gunners in the squadron adopted variations of his method. Their survival rates improved. Their aircraft returned with less damage. The correlation was hard to ignore. On September 1st, the 379th Group commander received a preliminary report. The data suggested aggressive early fire reduced bomber losses by breaking up coordinated fighter attacks, challenging 2 years of established gunnery doctrine. Meanwhile, Aru recovered in the station hospital. The fragments had missed major vessels and nerves. On August 19th, just 3 weeks after Kassel, he was cleared to return to duty. De Leo had been written off, too damaged to repair. Its replacement carried the same name and the same crew. On August 26th, Michael Aru climbed back into the tail position. The Luftwaffe had noticed the change. By early September, German intelligence reports noted American tail gunners opening fire earlier, sometimes beyond 600 yards. Attacks from 6 o'clock, once the safest approach, were becoming increasingly dangerous. Tracers reached out before pilots could stabilize their runs. Even when rounds fell short, pilots maneuvered instinctively. The psychological advantage had shifted, and the Luftwaffe began adapting, again. The Luftwaffe adapted in 3 ways. First, they increased approach speeds, diving on bomber formations at maximum velocity to reduce exposure time. Second, they shifted attack angles, coming from high 6 o'clock where gravity assisted the pullout. Third, they began targeting aircraft that appeared to have aggressive gunners, attempting to eliminate the threat before it spread. None of these changes solved the underlying problem. Higher speeds reduced accuracy. Steeper dives made tracking more difficult. Identifying aggressive gunners in advance proved nearly impossible amid the chaos of a running air battle. Between August 26th and September 5th, the 379th Bomb Group flew 11 missions. Aru flew 4 of them, adding 2 more confirmed kills. Other tail gunners in the group claimed 7 additional victories. Luftwaffe losses against the bomber formations continued to rise. German fighter commanders then experimented with concentration. Instead of dispersing interceptors across the bomber stream, they massed attacks against individual groups, hoping to overwhelm defensive fire through numbers. The tactic produced results on September 3rd. Concentrated attacks against the 100th Bomb Group destroyed 8 aircraft in 15 minutes. The 379th avoided similar losses by occupying a different position within the combat box. But the lesson was clear. The Luftwaffe was adapting, searching for weaknesses in the new defensive pattern. The air war over Europe had become a continuous cycle of adjustment. Each side studied the other, revised tactics, and attempted to regain the advantage. Aru understood the implications. His method worked because it disrupted expectations. Once the Germans refined their responses, the advantage would narrow. Each mission became a test, each engagement another data point. The mission scheduled for September 6th targeted Stuttgart, deep in southern Germany. The route required more than 500 miles over enemy territory, the longest penetration attempted by the 8th Air Force that month. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition from bases in France, Belgium, and Germany. Stuttgart produced ball bearings, components critical to vehicles, aircraft, and weapons across the German war economy. The city was heavily defended. Flak batteries ringed the area, and fighter squadrons were positioned along every likely approach route. The briefing on September 5th laid out the assignment. The 379th would fly in the lead position of the combat wing, responsible for navigation and bomb aiming for the formations behind them. Lead position meant absorbing the first fighter attacks. It meant flying straight and level while others maneuvered. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could bring. That evening, Aru checked his guns. Both Brownings had been fully serviced. Smooth feed mechanisms, fresh barrels. Instead of the standard 800 rounds, he loaded 1,200. The extra weight mattered less than firepower. Tomorrow would test everything he had learned. The Stuttgart mission launched at 5:40 on September 6th. 187 bombers climbed into an overcast English sky, forming up over the North Sea before turning southeast toward occupied Europe. DeLeo flew in the lead element of the 379th formation, positioned where Aru would face the first attacks from any direction. Fighters found them over France at 9:15. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lifted from airfields across the region, climbing to intercept before the bombers reached German airspace. The first attacks came head-on from 11 o'clock, testing the nose gunners rather than the tail. Aru waited, watching contrails multiply behind the formation. By 9:40, the Luftwaffe had begun concentrating fighters from multiple units. Intelligence estimates counted more than 100 interceptors tracking the bomber stream. Rear attacks began at 10:08. 12 Bf-109s positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the formation, then pulled up into a climbing attack from 6 o'clock low. Aru opened fire at 700 yards, sending tracers into the lead element. 2 fighters broke off immediately. A third absorbed multiple hits and fell away smoking. The remaining 9 pressed in. Cannon shells tore through the formation, striking bombers across the 379th combat box. The B-17 off Aru's left wing took hits to its number 3 engine. Another aircraft in the low squadron began trailing fuel from ruptured tanks. Aru kept firing, shifting from target to target as fighters flashed through his field of view. His ammunition count dropped steadily, 600 rounds, 500, 400. The attacks showed no sign of slowing. At 10:31, an FW-190 dove on DeLeo from directly above and behind, using the sun to mask its approach. Aru saw it too late. 2 20mm shells punched through the tail section before he could bring his guns to bear. The impact slammed him against the plexiglass. His left gun was destroyed, the receiver shattered by a direct hit. Fragments ripped through his flight suit, opening wounds across his arms and scalp. Blood poured down his face, partially blinding him. He kept firing with the right gun. The FW-190 pulled up and rolled away, trailing smoke from hits scored during the dive. Aru wiped blood from his eyes and searched for the next attacker. DeLeo was dying. Cannon fire had severed hydraulic lines, damaged the tail controls, and punctured fuel tanks in the wing roots. The pilots fought to hold altitude, but gravity and aerodynamics were winning. The formation reached Stuttgart at 11:04. DeLeo held position long enough to release its bombs over the target, then fell out of formation as the damage overwhelmed the crew's ability to compensate. 2 engines were running rough. Fuel was critically low. Over eastern France, the pilots made their decision. DeLeo could not reach England. The only viable option was a controlled ditching in the English Channel, where air-sea rescue might reach them before hypothermia set in. Aru stayed at his position as the bomber descended, scanning for fighters that might pursue the crippled aircraft. None did. The Luftwaffe had healthier targets still in formation. The bomber struck the channel at 1512, hitting the gray water at roughly 120 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart on impact. Aru was thrown forward, his head slamming into the gun mount. Darkness followed. When he regained consciousness, he was floating in a life raft. British rescue boats were already approaching. All 10 crew members survived the ditching. The aircraft that had carried them through 17 missions lay on the bottom of the channel. Within hours, the 379th Group Commander requested Aru's mission reports. On October 14, 1943, the Distinguished Service Cross was awarded, the second highest decoration the U.S. Army could bestow, recognizing his actions during the Kassel and Stuttgart missions. The citation specifically noted his decision to continue firing while wounded, crediting his defensive fire with protecting the bomber during its most vulnerable moments. By late October, 8th Air Force gunnery staff completed a broader analysis covering 14 bomber groups across 3 months of operations. The findings challenged assumptions that had guided American air combat since 1942. Tail gunners who engaged beyond 500 yards showed measurably higher survival rates than those who adhered strictly to standard doctrine. Early fire disrupted enemy formations, forcing German pilots into defensive maneuvering instead of allowing stable firing runs. Ammunition expenditure increased, but the trade favored survival. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson reviewed the results personally. The implications extended beyond individual aircraft. Coordinated early fire across bomber formations suggested the entire defensive doctrine required revision. The formal change came in November. New gunnery guidelines authorized tail gunners to engage at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. The language was cautious, but the meaning was clear. The approach that had kept Aru alive was becoming official policy. Aru never saw the doctrine take full effect. Head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching proved more serious than initially believed. After briefly returning to flight status in late September, he completed 3 additional missions before medical officers grounded him permanently. Recurring headaches and vision problems made continued combat duty impossible. His final tally stood at 17 confirmed kills, with 4 additional probables awaiting verification. Some records credit as many as 19, though documentation varies. The total placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force. The Distinguished Flying Cross followed the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his cumulative achievements. The Purple Heart acknowledged his wounds. By the end of his combat career, Aru had accumulated more decorations than most pilots. The 379th Bomb Group continued operations for another 18 months, through the winter of 1943, the invasion summer of 1944, and the final campaigns of 1945. The tactics Aru pioneered spread across the 8th Bomber Command. Tail gunners throughout the 8th Air Force adopted variations of early engagement. The statistical effects appeared gradually. Bomber loss rates declined through 1944, though multiple factors contributed. Longer-range fighter escorts reduced exposure. Improved aircraft systems increased survivability. Defensive gunnery played its part as well. The shift toward aggressive fire became one element of a broader improvement. German fighter pilots noticed the change. Interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe aircrew referenced the growing danger of tail attacks against American formations. The easy kills that had marked early interceptions became harder to achieve. Some pilots abandoned rear attacks entirely, shifting to head-on passes. The higher closure speeds were dangerous, but they reduced exposure to concentrated fire from the tail. Aru was shipped back to the United States in early 1944. The Army Air Forces assigned him to training duty, where he passed his combat experience to new gunners preparing for overseas deployment. For the remainder of the war, he taught the techniques that had kept him alive. The men who passed through his courses carried those methods into combat, over Germany, over Japan, and across every theater where American bombers faced enemy fighters. After the war, Aru made a decision that surprised many who knew him. He remained in uniform. When the United States Air Force was established in 1947, Aru transferred into the new service and continued serving for another 15 years. He retired in 1962 at the rank of Master Sergeant. For someone wounded twice, forced down in the English Channel, and repeatedly exposed to combat, the choice puzzled his peers. Aru had experienced more than most veterans would endure in a lifetime. Many with similar histories sought civilian life as quickly as possible. Aru saw his service differently. The Air Force had given him purpose during the darkest years of the century. The skills he developed had saved lives, his own, the crews he flew with, and the gunners he trained. Walking away felt like abandoning something that still mattered. His post-war life was quiet. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about combat. His medals stayed in a drawer. The memories remained private. Like many of his generation, Aru believed that those who had not been there could never fully understand. Others from the crew took different paths. DeLeo's navigator became a journalist and author, eventually publishing a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses. The book recorded the crew's experiences in detail, preserving moments that might otherwise have faded with time. The account ensured that DeLeo and her crew would not be forgotten. The 379th Bomb Group held reunions for decades after the war. Veterans gathered to remember those who never returned, to share stories their families had never heard, and to honor the young men they once were. Aru attended when his health allowed, reconnecting with survivors from those months over Europe. Michael Aru died on February 15, 1990, in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 70. He was buried 5 days later at the National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona. His headstone listed his rank, his service branch, and his war. It did not record the fighters he destroyed, the crews he protected, or the doctrine he helped change. Military cemeteries are full of understatement. Stone markers record names and dates, but they cannot carry the weight of what those names represent. Michael Aru lies among thousands of other veterans, each with a story that could easily disappear if no one takes the time to tell it. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England. The 379th Bomb Group's records are archived there, including mission reports that document Aru's combat service. Through those documents, researchers can trace the evolution of American defensive gunnery doctrine and see where his influence appears. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists. The aircraft that carried men like Aru into combat are mostly gone, preserved only as museum pieces and memorials, but the principles remain. He demonstrated the value of aggressive action over passive defense, the willingness to question doctrine when that doctrine was getting men killed. Those lessons outlived the aircraft, the formations, and even the war itself. Stories like this survive only when they are told. If you found this story worth remembering, consider supporting the channel by liking the video. It helps these histories reach more people. If you want more documented stories from the archives, you can subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. These were real people, facing real decisions with real consequences. Remembering them is how they avoid fading into silence.